Hello, my dear students. At the very outset, let me tell you that this is not going to be a full-fledged introduction to literary studies. The content I have for you today is restricted with respect to the syllabus that has been prescribed by the University of Kerala for study in the first semester under the BA English degree program. This is a new paper that has been prescribed by the university. Until the previous year, the first semester students used to learn the paper reading poetry as their core paper. Since 2020, we will have the paper Introduction to Literary Studies. So the university wants you to familiarize yourself with a few terms before you start learning the paper as such. So this session is to familiarize. The session is to introduce to you a few terms, a few key terms that are important as far as literary studies is concerned. So let's start learning this paper. Let's begin by analyzing the very term literary studies. What is literary studies? To define it in a sentence, it's study of literature. It's study of written works of imagination. The genres that you are familiar with are poetry, drama, and narrative fiction. But please don't be under the impression that it's too easy. It's not that simple as it seems to be. Because as you know, literature encodes within itself national histories, world events, individual psyche, race, class, gender, science, economics, religion, natural world. No, there is so much that literature incorporates in it. There is so much that literature discusses. Literature is representation of life, and life, as you know, is complex because you live in a society, you are part of a religion, you are citizen of a country, you are a part of a culture. So there is so much that form integral parts of the life you live. So these elements get encoded into the literature that we produce as well. So literary studies is basically study of literature or written works of imagination, but it's not something which is very much easy. Literature is an art form. So that brings us to the very first term that we need to understand with respect to your syllabus. What is an art form? Let's discuss that. It's very difficult to get a precise definition to this particular term, an art form. I went through some of the books that are available with me. I went through some of the articles that are available online. I could not, converge at a precise, proper, a single line definition for this particular phrase. So then I started, looking up dictionaries because dictionaries are places where you get precise definitions of things. So I skimmed through some of the online dictionaries and I found, these sentences that, might define this phrase art form. I looked up Merriam-Webster and found that it defines art form as a medium of expression. Look at the picture that you see on your mobile or your computer screen. It's a medium of expression. It's an art form. and something is being expressed there. Now, what exactly is being expressed, that needs to be, deciphered. But something is being expressed. So you find this definition that art form is a medium of expression. So that isn't something which we can, do away with. We have to consider that definition, because art form is definitely a medium of expression. I looked through Collins dictionary and I found out this particular definition for art forms. The Collins dictionary says, if you describe an activity as an art form, you mean that it is concerned with creating objects, works, or performances that are beautiful or have a serious meaning. So this is how Collins dictionary, puts forth the definition of art form. Now, something, if you want to call something as an art form, then it must be concerned with creating objects or works or performances that are beautiful. Now, please don't misinterpret the word beautiful. Now, there are things which add to the beauty as far as a work of art is concerned. We are talking about those elements, those aspects that add beauty to a work of art. So it must be beautiful, and also it must have a serious meaning. So there are a few, ideas that we can gather from these two definitions. Art form is definitely an expression, it's a medium of expression, and there must be something called meaning instilled into it, incorporated into it, and also there must be something called beauty in it. As I said earlier, don't misinterpret the literal meaning of the word beauty with what you come across in literature or in art. So we first of all understood or tried to understand what art form, sorry, what literary studies is. And since literature is an art form, it's very important that you understand the term art form also. So this is where we try to understand what is art form. Now let's also look at the concept called art, because if you don't understand what art is, then probably there is no point in discussing about art form. Now, art form is a medium of expression. Then what is art? That is what we are trying to decipher at this particular moment. Now, art is basically a human activity, a human activity that creates visual, auditory, or performed artifacts. So, art is basically a human activity. It's normally connected with the human world. And what do we create as part of this particular activity? What is the resultant product? What is the product that we create as part of this activity? We create visual, auditory, and performed artifacts. Artifacts means man-made things. And what does this convey? Now, why do we engage in this particular activity? Why do we create this visual, auditory, or performed artifacts? So as to convey something. It might be the author's imaginative or technical skill. It might be the thoughts, emotions, intuitions, and desires of an author. There are many things that you try to convey through the work of art that you create, through the art that you create. It might be your personalized experience of the world. See, everybody experiences reality or the world out there in their own way. You have a very personalized experience of the world outside. So you might use art to convey that particular subjective way of experiencing art. So art is basically a human activity. I hope you understood that. And why do we engage in that particular activity? So that we can convey a few things. It might be thoughts, emotions, feelings, intuitions. It can be the creative ability or the technical skill that you have in you. So, this actually validates the definition that we gave to art form earlier. that it is a medium of expression. And what are you expressing? You are expressing the things I said just now. So I hope these things are clear to you. The origin of art. Now, if you want me to talk about the origin of art, that is something which has been there for like forever. The oldest documented form of art are visual arts. As you can see, these are hieroglyphics, cave paintings. You know, the ancient form of art is perhaps visual arts, which include creation of images or objects in fields, including which can be connected with fields like painting, sculpture, photography, and other visual media. That is what we have today, but that is not what we had earlier in the initial days, ancient periods. Cave paintings, sculptures from rocks and stones, rock paintings, and also petroglyphs. Petroglyphs are carvings, or line drawn in a rock or on a rock, and when it is made into, or it is given a definite shape. So these are things which used to exist earlier, and these existed for like 40,000 years ago. We have found art or elements of visual art which existed like 40,000 years ago, but we don't know what the artists then intended with it. We cannot actually decipher the meaning beyond that particular art, because the culture in which it was made or created, the society or the life which formed the basis of that particular art. We haven't deciphered that, so the art remains like that. It's hard for us to decipher the meaning beyond those art. Now, we have ancient civilizations like Egypt, Mesopotamian civilization, Persian, even Indian, and also Chinese, Greek, Roman civilizations, which actually uphold or upheld the art which was actually alive then. Art was alive then. There was space for art and artists, but as of now we don't have enough resources to decipher the meaning beyond all those art. Now let's consider a few of the ideas that have been put forth by some of the popular scholars with respect to art. Now, it's important that you understand this term, understand this medium of expression, and it's very important that you take counsel or advice from popular figures in this field, who have researched this particular area for a long time. And it's probably Plato, in his work Republic, who made a statement on what actually art is. For him, art was representational. He used the term mimesis. Mimesis means imitation. For him, art was something which imitated. So whenever you come across the name Plato, now please remember this particular word, mimesis, which means imitation, because Plato believed that art is imitation, especially poetry, and that is why he exiled poets and poetry from his ideal republic. It is in Book 10 of his famous work Republic that he exiles poets and poetry from his ideal republic, because he believed that poetry is twice removed from reality. Poetry corrupts the ethics of people. Now it teaches bad lessons, or it gives bad lessons to people, and therefore poets and poetry, you don't have place in my ideal state or republic, so you are out. So Plato basically believed that art is an imitation, art is representational. And when you come down the history, when you come down when you pass different ages, we have other thinkers who have evaluated art, and one important philosopher and thinker among them is Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher. He defined art as a kind of representation that is purposive, which means that art has a purpose. Art has a purpose, and it is purposive in itself. It has a purpose. It might not have an end. He said, though without an end, it is purposive. It has a purpose, but it might not have, it might not achieve the result that it want to actually achieve. But it definitely has a purpose, and it promotes the cultivation of mental powers for sociable communication. This is something which Kant has noted, Kant has stated with respect to art. It is purposive. That is an important statement with respect to art. Plato said that it corrupts people, or to be precise, poetry corrupts people and art is representational. And Kant said that, Kant said that it is purposive in itself. It has a purpose. It has a purpose to fulfill. Whether it achieves this end or not, it has to be debated, but it definitely has a purpose. We also have yet another German philosopher who is called Hegel, who said that best artworks convey through sensory perceptual means the deepest metaphysical truth. So it conveys the deepest metaphysical truth. Metaphysical questions like what is life? That's a metaphysical question. It's something which Google cannot give you a precise answer. You can Google it up, you will find many search results, but will you get a precise answer to that question? What is reality? Yet another metaphysical question. What is truth? Yet another metaphysical question. Now these are all things which are pondered about in the area called philosophy, and perhaps that is why we have philosophers like Kant and Hegel, Hegel, making statements on such philosophical ideas, or connecting literature or art with such philosophical ideas. Now, so as you came across the definitions or the representations or the statement given by such scholars, you might have understood that there is no universal definition of art. No, there can be a general consensus understanding regarding what art is, but I don't know if if you can actually arrive at a universal, a precise definition of art. Yes, you can point out such statements which like the ones I made earlier, but I'm not sure whether you can arrive at a precise, proper definition of art. Let's also look at what are the important constituents of art. The major constituents of art include visual arts, which include architecture, ceramics, drawing, filmmaking, painting, photography, sculpting. Now, all these come under the constituent called visual arts, which you observe through your visual senses. You also have something called literary arts. Literary arts include fiction, drama, poetry, and prose. Now, as you can see on the screen, I have tried to represent, the different types of art that we see around us. Now, art is there in everything that we see around us. It's there in the way YouTube has arranged this particular page for us. It is there in everything that we ponder or peruse through the internet, everything that we browse using the social media. So, art is everywhere. So you have visual arts, which include architecture, drawing, painting, photography, etc. You have arts, which include fiction, drama, poetry, and prose. You also have performing arts. I'm sure you have come across this term, which include dance, music, and theater. We also have these days we also have something called culinary arts, which include cooking. Cooking is an art. I'm sure you will understand that when I say cooking is an art. So we have things associated with cooking which come under the term called culinary arts. So even that has become an art these days. Now all these focus on three components of art making. There are three components of art making: subject, form, and content. So these are the three important components of art. When these come together, art is created or art is produced. Subject, form, and content. Now, it's these basic components, that have always come together uh, in an inseparable way to create what is called art. So always remember, there are three components that come together to form art or to create art. They are subject, form, and content. Now, in general, you can treat subject as what the topic or the focus or the image that is being, portrayed in front of us. So subject is what is that the work talks about, what is the idea that the poem tries to convey, what is it that the image represent. So the subject may be thought of as what, the form is how, the development of work, the composition or the substantiation, that is what come under the form. How do the work convey the idea, how do the image represent the thing that it wants to represent, how does the film develops the idea throughout the period of its screening. So this forms the form. And finally, we have the content, which is why. So you can connect subject with what, you can connect form with how, and finally, you can connect content with why. What is the artist's intention? Why does he communicate this particular thing to you? Now, what is the meaning behind this particular representation or this portrayal? So these three components come together to form what can be called as art. Subject, which is what, form, which is how, and finally content, which is why. Now there are a few other terms which the syllabus um, which the university has incorporated into your syllabus, a familiarization of which you will have a base so that you can march ahead into the world of literature. And one among them is oral literature. I'm sure you know what oral literature is, but still, let us look at this particular term from the point of view of people who are engaged in doing business with English language and literature. And as you know, oral literature is what we had earlier. It existed even before written literature, because language existed in the vocal and oral domains. People used to speak, though not using the standard type of languages that we have today. No, they used to speak, and they used to listen. Now, somebody had to listen. That is what I meant by the statement that languages existed in the vocal and oral domains. Vocal and oral domains. And it was only later that utterances were given symbols or letters, which means that spoken languages existed earlier. And it was only later that we had the written form of languages. And oral literature is commonly known as folklore. Folklore. That is what we commonly use, the word that we commonly use. Now, what is oral literature? Let's try to understand it. Oral literature can be described as verbal art. Verbal art. Art that is delivered orally. Panande paatu. That is something which you are familiar with. Now, there is a story that is being portrayed in that particular song. It's part of folklore. It can be even made part of mythology. So that is what folklore or oral literature means. Art that is delivered orally. And it is transmitted from one person to another, or a generation to the next generation, or a region to another region through word of mouth. So it's not through a printed book or a written work that oral literature is communicated. It's communicated through word of mouth. You give it to someone else, and that person gives it to somebody else. I'm sure you might have listened to numerous stories when you were kids, when you were children, and I'm sure you might retain some of the stories for your kids. So this is something which is being passed on from generation to another generation. You listen to stories from your parents, and you give the same stories to your kids. Your kids too might give them to your grandchildren. So this is how oral literature is passed on from generation to generation. So please understand that oral literature means art that is delivered orally, and we commonly use the term folklore to refer to oral literature. The creator of folklore or oral literature or transmitter, the creator or transmitter did not write the song or the story. This is how, now this is one important point with respect to oral literature. The creator or the transmitter, the person who created the song or the oral art, did not write it down, but just told it. He just communicated it. He did not write it down and give the paper to someone else, but he just said it. He gave it orally. The receiver, the person who listened to that work of art, oral art, the receiver did not read the song or story but heard it. And that is how the communication happens. So there is never a stage called writing when you come to oral literature. So to speak about it in the most simpler form, oral literature refers to any form of verbal art which is transmitted orally or delivered by word of mouth. So this is what oral literature is all about. Now I can give you a plain sentence to describe it. It's a verbal art which is transmitted orally or delivered by word of mouth. So you have understood what oral literature is. So it's also important that you understand what written literature is. It's easier to understand. Now, once you understand what oral literature is, it's way too easy to understand what written literature is. Now, written literature is what we commonly understand as literature. The books, poems, anthologies, novels, everything that you come in printed form, that is what you call as written literature. Novels, poems, stories, essays, or anything that is primarily written down, and it is a written art. So I don't want to elaborate much on written literature because it is easy to understand. Now when you talk about novel or fiction, there is an important aspect that pops up. It's narrative forms. What is narration? What are narrative techniques? What is narrativity? Your syllabus also incorporates these terms, and I believe it's important that you understand these terms. It's only then you will be able to properly appreciate a work of art, be it a fictional work or be it a non-fictional work. Narration and narrative are two key terms in writing fiction. Narration and narrative are two key terms in writing fiction. Let's try to understand what narrative is and what narration is. Narrative is a report of related events presented to listener or reader. So what is narrative? Narrative is a report of related events, and it is presented to a listener or a reader using words arranged in a logical sequence. So this is something which is very much integral to every narrative. It is a report of events. You can even call it a story. A story. The word story can be used synonymously with narrative, but with focus on few important things. It is a report of related events, and it is given to a listener or a reader through words arranged in a logical sequence. A narrative or a story is told by a narrator. Okay, so you have somebody called narrator who reports these events, incidents that are chronologically arranged or that has a logical sequence. So a narrative or a story is told by a narrator who may be a part of that experience, or that person, that narrator, might share the experience as a first person narrator. So this is where we come to the different types of narrators. So narrative is reporting, related events using words arranged in logical manner. Narrator is a person who narrates to us this story. And we have, the activity or the process of narrating that story is what is called as narration. Narration is nothing but the act of telling the story. I hope you are able to differentiate between these terms. Narrative is its story. Understand it as the story. Narrator is the person who tells us the story. And narration is the process of narrating the story. So I hope you are able to differentiate between these three terms. And narration can happen at in different ways. It can be a first person narrative, and in this particular point of view, the character is the protagonist, or the protagonist, or you'll always notice I, me, we, in the first person narration. And then you have the second person narration. In this particular point of view, the author uses a narrator to speak to the reader. You will have a narrator in the story. In first person, it probably be the author himself who speaks out. In the second person, the author will have a narrator placed inside the story so that he can narrate to us the story. You will notice a lot of yours, in this particular type of narration. In first person, it was I, me, ours, we, and in second person, it is you and yours. You also have third person narration, and in this particular point of view, you will have an external narrator who gives us the story. We have an external narrator who is not in the story, who is not placed within the story. Now, the difference between second and third is that in second, you have a narrator in the story, but in the third person, you don't have that particular narrator placed within the story, but he is outside, someone who stands outside. And you'll notice usage of nouns, pronouns like he, she, it, they, commonly in the third person narration. So I hope that is clear to you. Now I spoke about narrative forms because it is an important part of fiction, and also because it has been incorporated into your syllabus. Now, the next thing that the syllabus wants you to identify or to distinguish between is what is poetry and what is prose. I'm sure I don't have to elaborate much on it. You have an idea regarding what is poem and what is prose. But let's, for the sake of understanding the finer details regarding these two concepts, let's look at some of the important finer details, as I said earlier. And prose and poetry, as you know, these are two common forms of literature. Uh, Prose, contains sentences and paragraphs, but does not have a metrical structure. You find a metrical structure in the stanzas, which are part of poetry. So poetry, you come across stanzas in poetry, and you come across sentences and paragraphs in prose writings. Poetry, it has rhyme included into it. You might have done that particular exercise when you were in school. You might have found out the rhyme scheme of a particular poem, and you don't do that with respect to a novel. You don't have something called metrical structure or rhyme pattern for a novel or a prose work. You don't do that with respect to an essay as well. You don't find the rhyme scheme of an essay, but you do that with respect to a poem. The basic difference between prose and poetry is that we have sentences and paragraphs, whereas lines and stanzas in poetry. So in prose you have sentences and paragraphs, but in poetry you have lines and which can be called as verses, lines and stanzas. And in prose, we have an ordinary style of writing. We have things like characters, plot, mood, theme, point of view, setting, etc. in prose. So there are certain things that you must give your focus, your attention to when you are compiling a prose work. You have to think about the setting of the work. You have to do something called characterization. You have to think about the characters, the point of view which needs to be conveyed. So all these are part of prose. Now, when you come to poetry, you understand that you don't have to stick on to a particular grammatical structure when you write poems. You are free in that sense. You don't have to restrict yourself, to grammar of the language when it comes to writing poetry. You are a lot free in that sense. And in prose, we have dialogues. In poetry, too, we have dialogues, but not the ones that we find in prose, not elaborate as the ones that we find in prose. Poetry, too, I agree. Poetry, too, has dialogues in it, dialogues between characters, but not as elaborate as it is found in prose. Now, poetry is something that arouses, completely an imaginative feeling, and there is something called diction which you must remember with respect to poetry. And diction means careful choosing of words, careful selection of words. And poetry, its idea communicated using minimum number of words. That is why we don't have to stick on to the grammatical structure of a language. So poetry, it has more connections with imagination, feeling, thought processes, subjective experience of the world. And to communicate all these things, poetry has to choose an appropriate language and selective words. Appropriate language and selective words. You can't just go on defining something on and on and on. You have to carefully select the words that will precisely communicate your idea, your thought, your experience of something to the reader. And in poetry, you find things like rhyme, rhythm, meter, pattern, stanza forms, etc. Now, in prose, you found things like setting, theme, character, plot. But in poetry, you find things like pattern, meter, rhyme, rhythm, stanza forms, etc. All right, so I hope that is enough introduction to prose, or you have, as of now, now you are able to distinguish between what is poem and what is poetry. Now, I have a few more things to introduce to you. The next thing I would like to introduce to you is novellas, and short stories. Novels and short stories you have come across earlier, but novella must be a new term to you. It's important that you have an understanding regarding these three terms, so that when you go through a novel in the future, or when you learn a novel in the future, now you will be able to distinguish. I have a problem with my power. I hope I'm back live. So I was talking about novel, short story. No, short story. No, these are all narratives designed to transport a reader to a fictional world. So basically, these are all narrative. Now, this is why I introduced the term narrative to you earlier. So now you understand what a narrative is. So when you call novellas, and short stories as narratives, you will not have any confusion left. You will be easily able to identify or understand what this particular meaning or particular word has, the meaning that this particular word has in connection to the novels, novellas, or short stories. So these are all narratives designed to transport a reader to a fictional world. Harry Potter, imagine the novel Harry Potter by Rowling. Now, it transports you to a fictional world, and it is a narrative as well. It is a, it's a story that is being narrated by an author or a narrator. Novels, they are the longest form of fiction, and it gives a plenty of breathing room. That is enjoys while compiling a novel. Now, with respect to novella and a short story, you don't enjoy that particular freedom. But when you come to a novel, you have that freedom. A novel can be of. Sorry again for that interruption. Yes. So I was trying to distinguish between novels, novellas, and short stories. Now, when you consider the length, novels have you know, the most length, and novellas are shorter when you compare it with novels. It might be longer than a short story, but definitely it is shorter than a novel. And short story is, when you consider the length, it has the minimum length. A short story has a more limited focus than novels or novellas. It has to talk about a particular event. It has to focus on a particular event, a few characters. No, you might have read a novel and you might have read a short story. You will understand that a short story is about a particular event, a particular thing that happened. But novel, it's elaborate. It talks about numerous slew of events possibly that happened in the protagonist, the central character's life. And with respect to techniques as well, novels, novellas, and short stories are different. Now, short stories doesn't employ numerous narrative techniques or devices or techniques. And but with respect to a novel, you have that freedom. You can incorporate any kind of narrative strategy. You can incorporate as many devices as you want to incorporate. So there is much freedom when you are compiling a novel, but the freedom becomes restricted when you choose a novella, and it becomes even more restricted when you choose to write a short story. So let me also introduce two more concepts to you before I wind up for the day. And the second last topic that I would like to talk about is electronic literature, because that is what is popular today. Now, please don't be under the impression that literature that you confront through electronic mediums, that is what is electronic literature. It has a slightly different meaning or interpretation. Now, electronic literature, it can also be called digital literature, is a genre of literature encompassing works created exclusively on and for digital devices. So that is where the definition or the understanding of electronic literature might stray away from the one that you have now. Now you might understand, or before I gave you this definition, you might have understood electronic literature as something which is something which you confront using an electronic device, but it's slightly different. No, literature that is created exclusively on and for digital devices. Now, that is what is called as electronic literature. Electronic devices like computers, tablets, mobile phones, etc. So, what is created using electronic equipment and what is created for electronic equipment. That is what is called as electronic or digital literature. Let me give you an example. Uh, a book that is originally in print form but is transformed into an e-book is not an example for electronic literature. I hope the difference is clear. A book which actually existed in print form, when it is converted into a digital form and perhaps read through an e-reader like Kindle, no, that is not an example for digital literature or electronic literature. What makes electronic literature different from other types of literature is that it is able to incorporate digital elements. It can incorporate into it digital elements like photos, music, etc. So please don't misinterpret or misunderstand the term digital literature or electronic literature. That is why I gave you an example. When you convert a printed book into a digital book, you cannot call it as digital literature. Something that is created specifically for electronic equipment, something that is created on and for digital devices like the ones I said earlier, computers, tablets, and mobile phones. That is what you call as electronic literature. And finally, we have something called popular literature, and it is with this that we will come to the end of this session. Your syllabus also, talks about popular literature, and popular literature includes those writings intended for the populace, for the crowd, for the masses. Literature meant for the masses, for the populace. Populace means a crowd, and those that find favor with larger audiences. So something that enjoys a large audience, that is what can be brought under this term called popular literature. For the populace, remember this word, for the populace. Then you can understand popular literature. Something that is made for the for a large audience, for the masses. That is what you can call or define as popular literature. And it can be distinguished from artistic literature. What you have on the other side is artistic literature. You have artistic literature on one side, and you have popular literature on the other side. And what is the difference? You can distinguish popular literature from artistic literature in the sense that popular literature is designed primarily to entertain. So if it has to be for the populace, for the crowd, for the mass, then it has to entertain that mass or crowd or populace. So that is a difference between artistic and popular literature. Now you have award movies. I'm sure that most of you might not want to watch award movies because it might lag. It might not entertain us. But we have other commercial entertaining kind of movies which we find our interest with. So that is how you distinguish between award sort of and commercial movies. Now you can take that kind of distinguishing, that kind of differentiation into this particular or these two terms as well, so as to differentiate between artistic literature and popular literature. So I hope you have an understanding regarding what is popular literature and artistic literature. So there, I have introduced to you many things today. I spoke about what basically literary studies is. All the terms that we met with today, that we confronted today, are important terms. These terms actually form the building blocks of what you are about to learn ahead in the future as part of your first semester. So I spoke about what literary studies is. Then we came down to art form, because literature is basically an art form. So it's important that we understand what an art form is. And once you have understood what art form is, or so as to arrive at a complete understanding of art form, it's necessary that you have an idea regarding what art is. That is why I elaborated to you on art and also spoke about the origin of art. And the reason why I pointed out some of the statements that popular philosophers and thinkers have made on art is because you need to understand that there is no one definition for art. There is no universal definition for art. Different people take it differently. So there are 30 in your class, or there are many out there who are watching. For them art might be different. Art might be different to each one of you. So you cannot arrive at a universal understanding regarding art. I also spoke about the constituent parts of art, the division of art into visual, performing, literary, etc. I also spoke about the components of art, which are subject, form, and content. Then I differentiated between oral literature and written literature. And it's in written literature that you come across something called narrativity or narrative, narrator, and narration. I elaborated on that as well. Then something that you need to distinguish as part of your first encounter with literature is the difference between poetry and prose. I also pointed out some of the important differences. I did not point out all the differences, but I did point out some of the important differences. And also the difference between novel, novellas, and short stories. And finally, we came down to electronic literature, and last we saw popular literature. So I hope you have an overall idea regarding what basically literary studies is, and what are some of the ideas that we need to familiarize ourselves with before commencing learning poems or novels or dramas or short stories. Thank you so much. I hope the session was worthwhile for you. Thank you so much for being with me. I'll see you in the next session. Thank you. Have a nice day.